Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another exciting virtual experience here with Pretty Gritty Tours. I'm your guide tonight, Chris, and man, we're going on a journey tonight. That's what I have to say about this. I can only imagine the YouTube comments that are going to come out of tonight's virtual exploration of the South Sound. But let's just establish something really quick. Freaking love it here. This region and Tacoma are some of the most wonderful places in the world, and every time I think that something can't possibly get weirder, Tacoma comes to the rescue. There is a lot of just strange claim to fames that Tacoma has in general, and then the region beyond that. But this is definitely one of the big ones that I feel like people should be talking about way more than they do. The whole UFO movement, the idea of men in black, this is a Tacoma thing, and it has now become internationally famous. But we are going to be exploring the areas and the roots and the origins of this story. And all I can promise you is, as weird as it starts, it will for sure be weirder by the end. Oh, man. It is good to see all of you guys. I'm so glad you're here. If you have questions along the way, please let me know. And if I'm not mistaken, the Maury Island incident team is actually here with us tonight. So I'm deeply, deeply honored. And I think that's actually a perfect introduction, because back in 2015, a short 30-minute historical documentary was made about this incident by local filmmakers. You can get it and watch it online. I'm going to share the link with everyone in the comments right now. And we got to watch the trailer here really quick so that you can get a little taste for what's going on. And oh man, this is the craziest story.
Let's try this. You tell me when I say something that isn't true. 6 flying discs, maybe 100 feet across, hollow, in the center. One of them is failing. You wonder if it'll crash into your boat. It happens very fast. You can feel it like a bomb.
So there's a little amuse-bouche of what's coming down the line for you guys tonight. And yeah, let's take it back to the origin and go from there. It's summer of 1947, June to be exact, when a gentleman by the name of Harold Dahl is on his boat. He is working as a timber salvage operator, where he goes out into Puget Sound. He collects timber that has wandered astray from the herd, and he sells it back to lumber mills. And while he's out on this salvage expedition, he sees these discs rise up off of the horizon, 6 of them. And as they come up, these donut-shaped flying discs, he notices that they're hollow in the middle, and that one of them seems to be a little different, like it's not quite flying right. And then it just starts spewing, according to his report, molten metal and like hot slag out of the center. Now, also on board this particular salvage vessel is his young son and their dog. as well as 2 workers. And they all witnessed the same incident where suddenly this flying disc, hollow in the middle, just starts ejecting all of this refuse and it comes flying out, striking the boat, causing damage to it, hitting people on the crew. It burns his son's arm and kills the dog. So in a panic, Harold takes the helm, rams it full throttle, and they drive this salvage boat, according to one account, up onto the beach where they abandon ship and hide in the forest until the flying discs disappear onto the horizon. They manage to push the boat back out into Puget Sound. Then they go and they return to where his employer, Fred Crisman, is waiting, and they report the entire incident. And this is the beginning, right? This is the most understandable part of the whole thing, and it's already so weird. So where does it go from here? Well, then suddenly mysterious figures start showing up. People start disappearing. The first ever official death of the U.S. Air Force is recorded. Stuff goes sideways so fast, it's unbelievable, and we're going to untangle that thread tonight. But first, I need to introduce you to where we're talking about, Maury Island, which is technically connected by a very narrow land bridge to Vashon Island. So if you're looking just north of the Tacoma area, that's what you've got out there. And back in 1947, this was revolutionary. It changed the way that people thought about the night sky. And since that time, it's become much more talked about, to the point where it is one of the most popular pieces of local folklore that you can encounter in the area. So much so that you can actually go, and I think one of the best is the Northwest Museum of Legends and Lore. It's an online museum at this point. You can check them out. They do incredible stuff. But there is even a Senate resolution, a Washington state resolution by our local state Senate, 8648, to recognize the fact that this happened on the 70th anniversary of the Maury Island incident. This became such a large thing that it's now canon. It's in our books thanks to a resolution. But trying to figure out what actually happened out there becomes one of the most confusing things possible. So this is a depiction of the flying disc, one of the 6 that was seen at that time, right? And Harold Dahl, pictured here, a photo that was contributed by his daughter Louise, is out there on this salvage vessel, right? They've got this tugboat out there. They're looking for logs, and then they see all these discs fly up on June 21st is one of the accounts. There's, again, some discrepancy here in 1947, and they see them rise up. The one gets injured, and then they all fly away. And Harold goes and confirms this story with his boss, Fred Crisman. And you're going to have to remember these 2 guys become the pivotal to the whole thing later, right? So they go back out and they collect some of this material, some of that molten metal and slag, and they keep it as evidence because they want to send it in and get it examined to figure out what was happening. And their minds are completely blown by the fact that this happened out there. Around the same time, 1947, the National Security Act of 1947 became law in July, so 1 month after this happens, which officially creates the Department of the Air Force, which will now be headed by a Secretary of the Air Force, separating it now from just a part of the Army. And they've gone into this around the same time. So there's already some hype about the new Air Force. There's the end of World War II, so there's a lot of suspicion as we start going into the Cold War. A lot of people are already thinking that Russia is sending out experiments into the air, and it's a tenuous pressure box of things that could go wrong, and they all go wrong pretty much at the exact same time. So a few days after the Maury Island incident happens, there is another gentleman who experiences something very strange, and he is a local pilot. And his name is Kenneth Arnold. Kenneth Arnold lives in Boise, Idaho, but he is a professional pilot, and he is finding himself one day flying from Chehalis to Yakima. And as he's going across looking for a wreck of a plane that had crashed so he can claim a $5,000 reward, he sees 9 glowing discs flying at a high speed and high altitude on the south side of Mount Rainier. And when he notices them, he sees that they are flying in a formation, that they behave non-erratically, but seem to have a dedicated path and design to them. And so when he lands, he immediately starts phoning people up, trying to figure out what's going on. And this is where the newly minted Air Force enters the scene. They send 2 investigators to go and talk to Mr. Arnold here and sort of corroborate his story and figure out what's going on. Because their first thought, of course, is that there is some sort of foreign hostile military activity dominating the skies over Washington state, and they want to be prepared for it. And you really got to understand the paranoia of the time because, we have just come out of World War II. Washington state is home to the Hanford reactor. There's a tremendous amount of nuclear activity and military secrets and weird espionage already coming to a boiling point here. So the first time that these discs come out, a lot of people have suspicion that it's something like a military power acting nefarious. So Arnold gives his story to these 2 investigators for the U.S. Air Force. They go on their way, having contacted him for future information, and then the descriptions start coming out. So this is one of the early artistic renderings that Kenneth Arnold comes up with of what he saw flying over Mount Rainier. What becomes interesting is he becomes a celebrity over his interest in these, and a lot of news sources start reaching out to him, being like, what did you see? What happened? And you can find tons of articles about Kenneth Arnold's experience with the flying saucers, including this book that he writes here. This is not the original cover, but this is the one that's on Amazon right now. And frankly, it was too good to not put into the presentation. So The Coming of the Saucers is a book that Kenneth Arnold puts out there, but a lot of his momentum for this entire thing comes from the Maury Island incident. Because after he hears about what happens out there, he dedicates himself to sort of investigating different occurrences as they're going on all around the area. He becomes the first sort of amateur UFO investigator searching for the answer to what he experienced that first time that he was out there on his flight. Not knowing at the time that a few days earlier, an original incident had happened in Puget Sound. That information would come to him later through the most mysterious of circumstances. So as he, unbeknownst to the rest of the world, is starting to detail his accounts here, I love this one. So of the people that contact him, he starts to put down more and more information. And this is one of the original documents that I could find where Kenneth Arnold puts down, a description of what he saw flying out there. And because he can't find anyone to really necessarily even believe him, he starts going on this campaign to prove what he found out there and to see if it's something true or not. I think that's an important part to the Kenneth Arnold story, is that he is the ultimate pragmatist. He would be the Scully of our duo here, where he's out there just trying to see if there is a more plausible description to what he saw. He knows very soberly that he saw these 9 glowing things flying across the sky on the south side of Rainier, and then he goes on an investigation to prove what they are. With the Maury Island incident, the earliest accounts that we can find is that Harold Dahl and Fred Crisman from the very beginning believed that it was something extraterrestrial, that there was forces greater than what people had previously imagined at work in these saucers flying around outside there, these hollow discs, these aluminum donuts, if you will. And so they reach out to a very different source, where Kenneth reports everything to the U.S. Air Force. The Crisman Dahl duo take their story to a local publication in Chicago called Amazing Stories. And they reach out to the editor at the time, Ray Palmer, this fine gentleman right here. Now, Ray has established a reputation throughout his industry of being able to take stories and turn them into amazing pulp fiction that flies off the shelves. So when Fred Crisman offers 2 fragments of the alleged UFO piece to Ray Palmer here, it really piques his interest. And he starts thinking that there's more to this story than he originally thought when he just received the letter, thinking that there should be something published. So who should he contact but Mr. Kenneth Arnold, our amateur UFO investigator who had, days after the Maury Island incident, seen these 9 flying discs by Rainier. Now, Kenneth is already hungry to prove himself, especially because he has had some national attention from pretty high-name sources, including Edward R. Murrow actually had an interview with Kenneth Arnold about what he saw out there. And you can actually see this, the transcript is the first time that I've been able to directly point to a source where they talk about flying saucers, right? And the way that Arnold describes them is, quote, boats on very rough water, very rough air, or some type of liquid. They flew like that, and they take a saucer and they flew in the way that you would skip something across the water, end quote. So Arnold's already been on the circuit, right? He's out there. He's trying to find other people who can corroborate his story. And then when the Dahl and Crisman story from Maury Island comes across to him from Ray Palmer, who's working for the Pulp Fiction magazine, he jumps at the opportunity to go and talk to them to see what they heard. And so he arrives in Tacoma. And obviously, for those of you who are in the area, you know, directly south from Maury Island is Dash Point, Northeast Tacoma, and then straight down from that is the city of Tacoma itself. And there are so many weird accounts from this time where it's hard to know what is accurate and what is not. And those of you who know me, I have a background as a journalist, so I try and always have at least 3 pieces of evidence that I can bring to the table to be like, this actually happened or it didn't. And then I try not to interpret too much in between the lines. But I had a hard time trying to track down exactly what happened here. But I know that there are multiple accounts that when Kenneth Arnold showed up here in Tacoma, that he said that there was no place for him to check in. So he goes to the finest hotel in Tacoma in 1947, which would have been the Winthrop, right down there across the street from the Pantages. And when he goes to get a room at the Winthrop, he checks in with his name and they're like, oh, we already have your reservation. Someone called and made a reservation for your room a day ago. So you're all set. Weird, right? Oh, just buckle up, my friends. We're just at the tip of the iceberg of weirdness right now. So Kenneth shows up and he reaches back out to those 2 U.S. Air Force investigators that originally had gone to him to ask for information about what he had originally seen. And he's like, guys, you're going to want to come out here and file an official report. We've got 2 guys who have seen the real deal. And as they're en route, Kenneth Arnold starts talking to Harold Dahl. And he's like, what did you see out there? And Harold says that he can't talk about it because somebody showed up days after the incident dressed in all black and told him that he can't talk about the incident whatsoever, that he knows what he saw out there, and that if he relays it to anyone, bad things are going to start happening to him. Right? So, yeah, here we go. Yeah, how things just happen to disappear. Oh, man, I don't want to ruin the end of this, but it's fantastic. So Arnold is in the hotel. He has Harold Dahl come to his room where they have this conversation about what he saw out there. And that's the first time that Harold starts talking about the fact that this mysterious man in black came and essentially tried to button him up. It was like, don't talk about what you saw out there. We're aware of it. You don't need to be. Don't tell anyone. So, of course, the first thing he does is squawk to this UFO investigator who flies out of Boise to go talk to him. Meanwhile, these 2 Air Force investigators are on their way to Tacoma, and they show up and they're like, all right, what are we doing? They take down the report. Let's see if I got the picture of them right here. They go over the evidence, and Harold and Fred offer this box of the metal fragments and the slag, the same stuff that they collected from day one of the incident, the same stuff that they sent to Ray Palmer over at Amazing Stories, asking him to, quote, analyze it, end quote. And they write everything down in their report. And then it's time for them to go. They check out of the Winthrop, which, pictured right here, in case you're curious, it's still there in Tacoma, and this is what it looks like right now. Glorious historic gem right down here. So they leave, and basically as they're leaving, they've already established that they think it's a hoax. So First Lieutenant Frank Brown here, Captain William Davison of our brand new U.S. Air Force, get into a B-52 with this box. And based on the stories that you hear, right, there are accounts that someone saw this box, that it was a cornflakes box that they had filled with different slag and stuff, and that Kenneth Arnold, or it's different people, as a local reporter in different stories, saw them get the box from Harold Dahl and Fred Crisman, put it into the trunk of their car before they drove off to get onto their B-52, and that they could see this mysteriously glowing slag coming out of the cornflakes box as they put it into their car. Their top secret material, by the way. They take their reports and their evidence, they send some of it through earlier communication so that the Air Force has a copy. They get on the B-52 and they take off to go back to the Air Force base where they can process this information, their alleged hoax, and the plane goes down. Oh, my friends, the plot thickens. So here's Mr. Harold Dahl, and this is when the B-25, the bomber, crashes on the side of Mount Rainier, just outside of Kelso. And based on the account and the forensic evidence that they looked at later, it looked like one of the engines had a failure and caught on fire. And Kenneth Arnold looked into it quite a bit too, because he had so many questions about this particular incident in it, and had an interview by Ted Morello, who was a local Tacoma News Tribune writer here in town. And Elmer L. Taft was one of the survivors of the plane crash. And Sergeant Taft related to everyone that while they were on board, the two investigators, I'll bring their picture back for you guys here, Captain Davidson and First Lieutenant Brown, were piloting the B-25 at the time. And once they recognized that that left engine was on fire, commanded everyone else out of the vessel, put parachutes on them and shoved them out the door, and then maintained control of the aircraft until it crashed. And they perish in the crash. And of course, the evidence is lost. This mysterious box of cornflakes full of extraterrestrial slag gets lost somewhere in the debris throughout the area. And notably, it's a huge crash site, right? Like, pieces of this plane were strewn throughout very wild, rural Mount Rainier wilderness near Kelso. And it was years before they even recovered various other parts of this particular crash. But the key piece of evidence goes missing. And this just pours gasoline on the fire. It would have been one thing if the two Air Force investigators had taken their box, filed the report that the whole thing was a hoax, and just flown away into the sunset to file something official. But now that the first two deaths of the brand new Air Force, like, they're not even a month old as a new branch of the military, and these two guys die investigating mysterious flying discs over Puget Sound, and now it's a big deal. So who responds right away? Well, the FBI. FBI tasks several agents to come out and talk to Harold Dahl, Fred Crisman, Kenneth Arnold. They will need the facts on everything and to know what happened, when it happened, and who was involved in the whole thing. And this is the first time that I saw an account of what happened immediately after the Air Force investigators left. that according to Kenneth Arnold, soon after returning to his hotel room, a Tacoma Times reporter, Ted Morello, who we just talked about, called to say that a mysterious telephone informant told him what had taken place in the hotel room. And then Ted goes on to describe everything in intimate detail to Kenneth Arnold. And according to Arnold's account to the FBI later, it was so accurate that he thought that someone had to have bugged the room, that they had to have been listening in on it, because he knew things about the conversation that people just couldn't have known unless they were there. Throw into the fact that there is some mysteriousness into the mechanical failure of the B-25 crashing, and it becomes a very serious investigation. Years later, people are still combing through the debris out there after that plane crashes on August 1st, 1947. And even today, pieces of the B-25 are still out there on the far side of Rainier. And this just sends it up into space. You know, people are now talking about this story aggressively and with a lot more teeth than they used to. And so more and more accounts are starting to show up. And like I mentioned, the Maury Island incident happens about a month before the whole Roswell incident. So one of the most famous, if not the most famous account of extraterrestrial contact, flying saucers, and government cover-ups happens after our Tacoma-based story. And ours is seasoned with the fact that there is a confirmed, documented death of these two Air Force pilots, as well as a huge investigation by the FBI post-World War II. And so now things are getting really serious. And as the FBI comes back and questions Harold and Fred Crisman, both of them deny everything. They say that the entire story was a hoax, that they made it all up. So here's the original, one of the original redacted FBI reports about all these investigations into flying discs. And as they're talking to Dahl and Crisman, the only thing that they get from the confirmed is that they made the entire thing up, that it was a hoax, and that the debris that they found consisted just of scraps and pumice from Maury Island itself. And a lot of people speculate that the metal and the rock that they picked up off of Maury Island was actually industrial slag from the Asarco smelting plant just across the water from there. That it would have just been essentially industrial waste, and that it would have had some mysterious or dangerous looking qualities to it. But that was a completely different experience, nothing to do with extraterrestrial, right? Oh man, guys. We're not even to the weird twist yet. Dahl and Crisman deny everything. Nothing happened. Wink, wink. Everything's fine. Sorry we made it up. Sorry that your Air Force boys died, but we don't want anything to do with it. And one thing that I think is particularly interesting about that is that when you go to the official records, Dahl in particular never says that it was a hoax and that he made the whole thing up for X, Y, or Z. He says that he will no longer talk about it, that he doesn't want to be involved with the story anymore, and that he wants to just wash his hands of it. So it's not that he was like, guys, I'm sorry you caught me. He's like, I'm done with this. I won't talk about it to anyone anymore. I promise you. Which is a very different sentiment than, shucks, guys, sorry I lied to you. Well, that's about the time that the whole flying saucer UFO phenomenon just blows up nationwide. People start talking about it everywhere, and it starts becoming part of the national vocabulary, that there are these extraterrestrials coming out here, and that a significant amount of this extraterrestrial activity is happening out here in Washington state. And there are frequent stories of people seeing very similar discs again and again and again. And actually in the Kelso area, the story of the alien that comes and visits people's barns, I feel like I've talked about this, especially in connection with the Mima Mounds down by Olympia, where multiple people saw something similar, where there would be a mysterious figure with sort of a metallic tinge to them, as if they were wearing no clothes, but their body looked sort of aluminum, would be standing outside of their house or in front of a barn. and that if people went out with like their shotgun full of rock salt to confront the intruder, they would shoot straight up in the air vertically and just hover before flashing away in a bright burst of light. And there are lots of different stories showing up in this exact sort of time frame, kind of beginning in the mid 1950s through the 70s, about these encounters happening out by Rainier again and again. And to be fair, it all starts with this original Maury Island incident, and the story kind of always follows the same trajectory as the first one with Kenneth, Harold, and Fred. What got me, though, is how the records don't match up. So if you were to do an extensive search, and I have, on Mr. Harold Dahl in particular, there are so many different stories that show up that when the investigators for the Air Force popped up and asked him questions, that he took him to this local cafe to meet his secretary, and that after they talked at the restaurant, she just disappeared, and that they went back to her house and or restaurant, and that the place had been abandoned, that it looked like no one had been living there for years. Or the weirdest one for me is that there are multiple accounts that after Harold Dahl talked to the authorities, his son went missing. But I can't find anything about his son at all. He shows up as a brief mention in the official FBI report taken back in 1947, and then that's it. There's no mention of him anywhere, and that is unusual, especially at the time with a rash of disappearance and kidnappings. Even though the Weyerhaeuser kidnapping had made such national headlines earlier in time, that to have something like that happen, there would have at least been a mention of it somewhere in a local publication, and I can't find anything. So as Harold Dahl's son mysteriously disappears, so does Harold. He kind of just drops off the record, and there isn't anything definitively that can really be found about him other than these original FBI reports, which is how I know that there had to have been a Harold Dahl figure, right? These are the now declassified documents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where they talk about talking to these guys and figuring out their flying disc story. And the FBI also comes to the conclusion that the entire thing was a hoax. Very, very strange, though, is the fact that now these people just start disappearing, with some notable exceptions. So as Dahl disappears into the ether, the story really focuses on him. If you look, I think this was an article from the 1970s, and the story keeps getting repeated again and again, 80s and 90s. Even today, after the Senate resolution, it's become a major talking point for the state of Washington. And always, Harold Dahl is kind of the key figure. Kenneth Arnold, Harold Dahl, seeing this, coming out and corroborating the whole thing, and then the explosion of extraterrestrial sightings in the area. But the fact that Harold was really the sub figure, right? He wasn't even the sticking point for this whole thing. He wasn't the guy who suggested sending this material out to the Pulp Fiction magazine. He wasn't the guy who wanted to keep going with the story. He wasn't even a major figure in the whole thing until he shows up in these investigations. It's really Fred Crisman, the owner-operator of the timber salvage company, who employs Harold Dahl, who is kind of the tip of the spear for this. And tuck that in your back pocket, because that becomes important here. So set your minds now into like the 1950s. Gray Barker, I'm going to give credit as the author who really puts even more rocket fuel on this particular incident, because Maury Island disappears from like a national consciousness after the FBI kind of button the whole thing up. They conclude their investigation, say the whole thing's a hoax. They move on. And then in the mid 1950s, this guy, Gray Barker, publishes a book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And he pulls a lot of his information from this incident out on Maury Island, and then talks a lot about Ray Palmer, the editor for Amazing Stories. And they go on to sort of like connect the dots between all these different incidents, creating a cohesive narrative that now people can run with. This launches us into things like now we have the Maury Island Incident Historical Society. The historical feature have been made, and a lot of this was built on that original foundation. But for me, the weirdest part of the story is actually Fred Crisman. So I had to do some digging, right? I needed to actually figure out what was happening out here and whether or not there is something that we could point to be like, this is an area you could go and do some investigation for yourself. And spoiler alert, there's tons. Maury Island is a big one. Des Moines in Seattle's South Side has a lot going on for it. In fact, I think they have an audio walking tour of the Maury Island incident. But this is the stuff with Fred Crisman. So if you dig up information on these gentlemen, the only thing that I can find about a Mr. Harold Dahl is tax evasion. He shows up in some of the early Tacoma articles for tax liens and then just kind of disappears, right? There's no articles about him losing a son or having his dog killed or weird slag from a molten flying aluminum donut crushing his ship. Like, there's tons of information about Kenneth Arnold and what he saw. There's tons of information about the crashing of the B-25, the U.S. Air Force investigation, the FBI's involvement in this entire thing. But Mr. Harold Dahl very conveniently kind of disappears from the whole story. And we have a picture of him. We know that he existed because he's here in tax documents, the most official and well-recorded of all documents. If you want to know anything, go to the IRS. But where does the story get interesting? Well, there's a lot of information about Mr. Fred Crisman, and all of it weirder than the last. So the first thing I saw is that he ends up as an educator here in Tacoma. He leaves the lumber salvage business and starts showing up as a teacher in Tacoma. And that's where I got tipped off to his obsession with amazing stories. So you may recall that it was Fred Crisman who first suggested that they should send that box of material to Ray Palmer, the editor over at Amazing Stories. And it wasn't just a fluke that popped into his head. He had already known Ray Palmer very well, in fact, because he had sold Ray Palmer a story where, according to Mr. Fred Crisman, while he was overseas during World War II, he was in Burma and he was abducted by a series of subterranean species people that live in a mysterious and unknown catacomb system at the core of the planet, where they dedicate their lives to torturing humanity. Oh yes, my friends, Mr. Fred Crisman was a big believer in a lot of different things, not the least of which was the conspiracy theory that there are giants that predate human history, and that every time one of their skeletons is unearthed in an archaeological dig site, a government agency swoops in and destroys it. His other one that he was a passionate believer in is that in the center of the earth, a mysterious half-robot race of diminutive sadists known as the Darrow control humanity's suffering with leftover alien technology. Oh my gosh. That these guys pictured here with the weird elephant noses live underground, where occasionally they abduct humans from the surface and then force them to be tortured for an eternity and use their alien technology to prolong their life so that they can continue torturing humans beyond their natural lifespan. And that they use these telegraphing rays to penetrate the Earth's crust and control people's thoughts or make them hear voices or make them effectively go crazy and then pilot them around to do evil things around the world. Fred Crisman not only believed all of this, but he believed that he himself had been abducted in a cave in Burma and tortured by the Darrow before his dashing escape. And upon returning after his service back here into the United States, he sold that story to Ray Palmer over at Amazing Stories, who turned it into the popular fiction that people see today. So here it is, Richard Shaver's Chilling Tales from the Inner Earth. This is part of the original conspiracy theory prompted by Fred Crisman, who came up with this before seeing the flying discs over Maury Island. Okay? Well, wait. Oh man. That's not even just the half of it. Because then he's subject to another FBI investigation after the Maury Island incident. He hangs up his hat on this. He's like, I promise I made the whole thing up. Just leave me alone, suits. And then they show up on his door later because he, while a teacher at a local high school, is accused of starting a secret society. He gets fired from his job after starting a fight with the superintendent, John Drake. And when people show up to investigate what's going on, they find that he has started a secret society of conspiracy theories with students from the high school. But it's not the last time that he's investigated by the FBI. Not too long after that, documents show up about him where he is one of the people who gets fingered as being responsible for the Kennedy assassination. And if you're not familiar with the concept of the three tramps, essentially, these three homeless-looking guys were photographed being escorted out by law enforcement after the Kennedy assassination, and that a lot of theories believe that one of these guys could have possibly been the shooter for Kennedy. And against all odds, or perfectly in line with everything, Kenneth Arnold ends up not just being accused, but actually brought in for a grand jury testimony because they think that he is one of, if not the shooter for the Kennedy assassination, and that he most closely resembles one of the three tramps from that photograph. And so there's yet another batch of FBI documentation on Fred Crisman of him being involved in some weird stuff. And to give some even more credibility to it, he actually knew people involved in the whole thing. Like, he had been in secret conspiratorial societies with other members who had also, in their own corners, on opposite ends of the country, been involved in some way with accusations in the Kennedy assassination. So what do you do at this point? After the third time that you're being investigated for some sort of conspiracy theory, whether it's flying discs, secret societies with high school students, or assassinating Kennedy, well, you do the only thing that makes perfect sense. You come up with a pseudonym. Why don't we go with John Gold? And you start a radio program out of Puyallup and write a series of books. The most important and prominent is called Murder of a City, Tacoma. So in 1968, Crisman starts hosting this radio talk show under the pseudonym John Gold on KAYE and publishes the book The Murder of a City, Tacoma, which gets published in 1970. And my favorite thing I've ever read about it, I've seen pages from it, it's pretty amazing, is from my absolute favorite Tacoma historian, Michael Sullivan. Michael Sullivan read and reviewed this book, and he says, quote, "It's a weird, politically slanted rant that manages to tie corruption in Tacoma to everything from communist infiltrators to the Kennedy assassination." Tell me that doesn't sound like the most glorious weekend read ever. So Crisman publishes his book, taking all of this stuff that's ever happened in Tacoma, weaving it into the nexus of everything from Kennedy getting shot to Darrow underground, a semi-robotic, demonic subhumans piloting the human race and causing ultimate suffering. And then in 1975, just like months after getting married, passes away. And with him, a lot of this story around the Maury Island incident kind of takes a dive for a little while, until it starts getting picked up again by local investigators. And when you go back, I'm always going to go back to the source on this stuff. The most official stuff that you can look at is, of course, the FBI documents, where they come out and investigate, due to the loss of these 2 Air Force pilots, what happened with these flying discs that were first discussed by Kenneth Arnold, Harold Dahl, and Fred Crisman. The second one, of course, is the documentation from the airline pilots themselves with the initial investigation when they come out as part of the Air Force Intelligence Unit trying to figure out what was happening out here. And yeah, that one here talks about the evidence from the incident being stored in a cigar box, not a cornflakes box. And that they contact everyone, that they determine that it's a hoax, but then shortly after that, they pass away. Right before Fred Crisman's death in 1975, Crawdaddy magazine, which I don't know if anybody else is familiar with this, writes an article about Fred Crisman definitively being one of the 3 tramps from the Kennedy assassination, and that his secret encounter with the men in black was what prompted him to stay silent about everything. And that then puts, I think, a firm pin in the idea of the Maury Island incident becoming a Washington story forever and always. It is now part of our local lore forever, as far as I'm concerned. So much so that a lot of people have really gotten into it. That picture that you saw early on is actually from a mural over in Des Moines depicting the Maury Island incident. Of course, the Maury Island film community put together the 30-minute movie that I showed you early on. And if you go out to Vashon on the north end where their airfield is, they have this piece of public art, which was deliberately created to commemorate the Maury Island incident back in 1947. And you can go out and visit this right now if you want to get a taste of your own UFO action. But what can I say? The truth is out there. And when I dug deeper and deeper into the truth of this story early on, it blew my mind, because the stuff that came out of it was even wilder than the initial story. Like 6 flying discs flying up out of the ocean and spewing molten slag. All right, I could get on board with that. But then this whole Fred Crisman conspiracy propaganda machine that goes from everything from internal Darrow up to the Kennedy assassination is just mind-blowing. So I encourage you to look into it, and at the end of the day, have a great deal of pride in the Tacoma region, from Vashon to South Seattle, all the way down here, a little golden triangle of weird stuff happening out here. And as you know, I'm a big fan of this. From our whole Bigfoot experience in the Pacific Northwest to this, there's a lot of really great stuff that happens out here. And so the next time someone's like UFOs, you could be like, haha, that's from my home. You're very welcome, everyone. So if you guys have questions, let me know. I would be happy to field any of them right now. If you've enjoyed your night, you can always tip your guide. It's how we manage to keep these programs going for you guys, right on the homepage of Pretty Gritty Tours. And I'm around, because I'm digging this stuff. We've got some great virtual content coming up here over the next few weeks. Our next big one is actually about the Asarco smelting plant. Is a special Earth Day program with the Foss Waterway Seaport, talking about the legacy of the largest smelting operation in the Pacific Northwest and just the fallout from that over generations. So I'll do what I can. I will endeavor hard to make more virtual presentations, because it is indeed. Thank you, guys. And yes, it absolutely would. Sometime I'm going to do a whole thing on submarine bases and what goes on at the base of Puget Sound, but I don't want to get abducted by men in black myself. So let's leave this. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate you coming out as always. You are the light that keeps me alive inside. Until next time, I encourage you to pour frosty Mac and Jacks and keep on exploring. I'll see you soon, guys.